The valley woke slowly, as if it had forgotten how to breathe. Dawn did not arrive all at once. It slipped gently over the hills, spilling pale gold across a land that no longer answered with warmth. Frost clung to the grass like a stubborn memory. The wind moved softly, but it carried a quiet ache, the kind that settles into bones and lingers without invitation. At the farthest edge of that valley, where the land curved away from the town like a forgotten thought, there stood a small cabin. It leaned slightly, as though tired, its would weather by seasons that had not been kind. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from its chimney, hesitant but determined, like hope that refused to leave even when it had every reason to. Inside that cabin lived a woman the town had already decided it understood. Her name was Eliza May Carter. She moved with the kind of quiet that comes from carrying too much for too long. Her hands were rough, marked by years of working soil that often gave little in return. But when those hands touched the earth, there was a gentleness in them, a patience that spoke of something deeper than survival. Grief had settled into her life the way winter settles into the valley. Not sudden, not loud, just constant. Some said she had not been the same since her husband passed. Others said she had always been a little different. The truth, like most things worth knowing, lived somewhere quieter than gossip could reach. Eliza did not spend much time in town, and when she did, she moved like someone passing through a place that no longer belonged to her. There was always a dog at her side, Ash. He was not large, nor particularly striking at first glance. His coat carried the soft gray of ash after a fire has gone cold. But his eyes, they held something steady, something knowing. He walked close to Eliza, never pulling, never wandering far, as though he understood that his place was not ahead of her or behind her, but beside her. People noticed the dog more than they noticed her, maybe because it was easier. Near the center of the valley stood the general store, a place where voices gathered and lingered longer than necessary. It was there that stories grew, shaped more by opinion than truth. On a cold morning, with the wind threading through the wooden beams, a few men stood near the porch, hands wrapped around tin cups of coffee that had long since lost their warmth. Her name came up the way it often did, lightly, carelessly. A man named Caleb Boone leaned back against the railing, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. Said she's still out there digging at that dead land. A quiet chuckle followed, not cruel enough to feel like cruelty, but not kind enough to be anything else. Another voice joined, softer. Ain't nothing out there but frost and rock. Caleb shrugged, taking a slow sip. Some folks don't know when to let go. No one said her name again after that. They didn't need to. Eliza stood just inside the store, her hands resting lightly on a small bundle of supplies. She had heard enough. Not all of it, but enough. She did not react. Silence had become her way of moving through the world. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned that some words were better kept where they could not be misunderstood. Ash sat near the doorway, watching, always watching. When she stepped back outside, the cold greeted her like an old acquaintance. Familiar, unwelcome, unavoidable. She did not return home right away. Instead, she walked past the visible stretch of land behind her cabin, where the soil lay pale and unyielding beneath a thin crust of frost. The path she followed was narrow, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. It curved gently, leading away from everything the town believed they knew. Ash moved ahead this time, just slightly. Not pulling, guiding. There was a rhythm to their steps, something practiced, something shared without words. The land changed as they moved further. Not dramatically, not in a way that would catch an untrained eye, but the air felt different, softer somehow, as if the cold had loosened its grip just enough to allow something else to exist beneath it. They reached a small hollow tucked between low rises of earth. It was hidden in the quietest way, the kind of place that does not reveal itself unless invited. Eliza knelt slowly. Her fingers brushed aside a thin layer of frost, careful, almost reverent. Beneath it, the soil was darker. Not frozen solid like the rest of the valley. Not dead. Alive. Small green shoots pressed gently upward, fragile but certain. They did not rush. They did not fight. They simply grew. Eliza exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. There you are. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, carried away almost as soon as it was spoken. But the words seemed to settle into the earth, as though they belonged there. Ash laid down beside her, his body warm against the cold ground. His eyes followed her movements, steady and calm. She worked slowly, brushing away frost, adjusting the thin covering she had placed to protect the plants. Each motion was deliberate, guided not by urgency, but by care. This place was not large. It would never be enough to feed a town, but it was enough to remind her that something still listened when she tried. The wind softened as the sun climbed a little higher, though its warmth did not reach far. The valley beyond remained pale and brittle, stretched thin beneath a sky that offered light without comfort. Eliza stayed there longer than she planned. Time moved differently in that hollow. Slower, kinder. When at last she stood, her knees stiff and her hands dusted with dark soil, she looked out toward the distant line of the town. Smoke rose from chimneys there too, thicker, more certain. Lives continued. Voices carried. But none of that reached this place. She turned back once more, her gaze lingering on the fragile green life pressing quietly against the cold. Not everything that grows needs to be seen. The words left her gently, as though they had been waiting. Ash rose beside her, brushing lightly against her leg. Together, they began to walk back, leaving behind the hidden hollow that held more than the valley believed was possible. Above them, the sky stretched wide and pale, and beneath the frost, something patient continued to grow. Winter did not arrive with drama. It came quietly, like a door closing somewhere far away, and by the time anyone noticed, it was already shut. The mornings grew heavier first, not with sound, but with stillness. Frost no longer melted when the sun rose. It lingered, settled deeper into the ground, as if claiming it. The soil across the valley stiffened, turning from something that once breathed into something that only endured. By the second week, the wind had changed its voice. It no longer whispered. It carried a sharper edge now, slipping beneath doors, through cracks in wood, through the spaces people forgot to guard. It touched everything. Crops that had been struggling gave up entirely. What little green remained bent low, then disappeared beneath pale dust and ice. The valley, once stubborn in its life, began to forget how to grow. In town, people spoke less, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much they could not fix. At the general store, shelves grew sparse in a way that made no noise, yet echoed louder than any argument. Hands that once reached without thinking now paused, counted reconsidered. Small things were stretched longer than they were meant to last. A mother folded the last of her flour into something thinner than bread. A man stood too long by an empty crate, as if staring might bring it back. And beneath it all, there was a quiet unraveling of certainty, of pride, of the belief that tomorrow would take care of itself. Caleb Boone still stood near the porch some mornings, but even he had grown quieter. His voice, once easy with dismissal, carried less weight now. The cold had a way of humbling even the strongest opinions. Still, old habits lingered. "She's out there somewhere, I suppose." The words came from him one afternoon, not quite mocking, not quite kind. Digging at ghosts. No one laughed this time. The wind answered instead, moving through the wooden beams with a hollow sound that felt too much like agreement. Eliza May Carter did not come to town as often. Not because she feared it, but because there was less reason to go. Her needs had grown smaller over time. Simpler. What she could not find, she learned to do without. Her days followed a quiet rhythm. Morning light through worn curtains. A small fire coaxed into life. Hands wrapped briefly around a cup that offered warmth but little else. And always, Ash waiting by the door, patient in a way only creatures untouched by doubt could be. They walked the same path each day. Past the brittle land behind her cabin, past the places that no longer tried, and further still into the hollow that remained untouched by the valley's surrender. There, something impossible continued. The soil held its softness. The green shoots, though small, had grown steadier. Not faster, just certain. Eliza tended to them with care that asked for nothing in return. She covered them when the wind grew harsh, uncovered them when the light softened, and spoke to them in quiet tones that felt less like words and more like remembering. Ash stayed close, though sometimes he would wander just beyond the edge of the hollow, circling as if guarding something unseen. There were moments when it felt as though he knew this place better than she did, as though he had brought her here long before she realized she needed to find it. One evening, as the sky turned a pale, distant gray, Eliza noticed something different. Footsteps, not fresh, not close, but there. The faint imprint of boots at the edge of the hollow, half hidden by drifting frost. She stilled. Ash lifted his head, ears shifting, but did not bark. The prints did not come far. They lingered near the edge, then turned away, as though whoever had made them understood this was not a place to enter uninvited. Eliza said nothing, but something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the fragile awareness that her quiet world might not be entirely unseen. The next morning, there was a small stack of firewood by her door, neatly cut, dry, enough to last several nights. No note, no sound of who had brought it, just presence and then absence. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers brushing the rough edges of the wood. Ash circled it once, then settled beside it, as if it belonged. It happened again 2 days later. A tool she had left worn and dull was returned, sharpened without a word. And once, when the wind howled harder than it had all season, she found her window reinforced from the outside, the loose board secured with care that spoke of quiet hands and steady intention. She began to understand. Jonah Hale. He was not a man the town spoke of often, not because there was nothing to say, but because he did not offer himself to be spoken about. He worked with wood the way Eliza worked with soil, patiently, without need for attention. She had noticed him before. In passing, a nod here, a shared silence there. He had never looked at her the way others did. Not with curiosity, not with dismissal, just with a kind of simple recognition, as if he saw her standing there, and accepted that as enough. Days passed, and the cold deepened. Inside the hollow, Eliza's hidden farm held on. She adjusted her coverings more carefully now, watched the sky more closely. There were nights when she barely slept, listening to the wind as though it were a warning. The valley beyond had grown quieter still. No laughter now, no careless words, only the slow, heavy sound of people enduring. And beneath that, something else. Need. It crept in quietly. At first in the way people lingered longer near empty shelves. Then in the way eyes avoided meeting one another, as if hunger carried a kind of shame. Children's voices grew softer. Fires burned lower. The valley, once proud in its independence, had begun to bend. One evening, as Eliza stood at the edge of her hidden field, the sky pressing low and heavy above her, Jonah appeared. Not suddenly, not intrusively. He simply walked the path, stopping a few steps away, as though mindful of crossing something sacred. Ash did not move. That was enough. Jonah's gaze drifted over the small stretch of green, his expression unchanged. No surprise, no disbelief, just understanding. He did not step closer. Some things don't ask to be explained. His voice was quiet, shaped by the same stillness the valley had come to know. Eliza did not answer right away. The wind shifted, softer for a moment, carrying the faint scent of earth that had not yet given up. It won't be enough. Her words came gently, not as doubt, but as truth. Jonah nodded once. Enough doesn't always start as enough. Silence followed, but it was not empty. It settled between them, steady and calm, like something that had been waiting to exist. He turned to leave, just as simply as he had arrived. At the edge of the hollow, he paused. Cold makes people forget who they are. He said it without looking back. But it doesn't have to. Then he was gone. Eliza stood there long after, the words resting quietly in her thoughts. Beyond the hollow, the valley stretched wide and pale, its strength worn thin by a winter that did not seem ready to end. She looked down at the fragile green beneath her hands, at the life that had no reason to continue and yet did. Inside her, something shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to be felt. The kind of feeling that comes before a decision, before a change that cannot be undone. The wind rose again, colder than before. And for the first time, Eliza wondered not if the valley would survive, but whether she was meant to help it. The valley had grown so quiet, it almost felt like a held breath. Not peaceful, no. There was nothing gentle about the silence now. It carried weight, the kind that pressed against doors and settled into empty cupboards and lingered in the hollow spaces between heartbeats. Morning came without birdsong. Even the wind, once restless, seemed tired of speaking. Inside small homes scattered across the valley, hunger had begun to soften voices. Conversations shortened. Movement slowed. There was a carefulness to everything, as though each action must be measured, each choice weighed against what little remained. Children no longer asked for more. They simply accepted less. And somehow, that was harder to bear. Eliza May Carter stood by her small wooden table as dawn slipped quietly through the edges of her window. The light touched everything gently, as if afraid to disturb what little remained. On the table lay what her hands had gathered. Not abundance, not enough for a season, but more than nothing. Root vegetables, small and imperfect. A handful of greens, still holding onto their quiet strength. Pieces of life that had refused to surrender, just as she had refused to stop tending them. Ash sat near the door, watching her with that same steady gaze. There was no urgency in him, no fear, only presence. Eliza rested her hands on the edge of the table. For a long moment, she did not move. The valley had not been kind to her. It had turned its face away, laughed softly, dismissed what it did not understand. It would have been easier to remain unseen, to protect this small, fragile miracle and let the rest of the world continue as it had chosen. But kindness, the kind that lives deep in the bones, does not ask for permission. It simply waits until it cannot remain still any longer. She exhaled slowly, then began to gather. Each piece of food was wrapped with care, placed into small baskets lined with cloth worn thin from years of use. There was no rush in her movements. No hesitation now, either. Only intention. Ash rose quietly as she stepped toward the door. The morning air met them with its familiar chill, but something in it felt different. Not warmer, no, but softer, as though the world itself was watching. They walked into town before the sun fully rose. No one saw them, or if they did not understand what they were seeing. Eliza moved like a shadow between homes, her steps light, deliberate. At each doorstep, she paused just long enough to leave something behind. A basket, no note, no name, just food where there had been none. At the first house, a mother would wake later and find it resting quietly by her door. She would look around, confused, then gather it close as if it might disappear if she hesitated. At another, an old man would stand for a long while, staring down at the offering, his weathered hands trembling not from cold, but from something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, or disbelief. By the time the sun rose fully, Eliza and Ash were already gone. Back beyond the edge of the valley. Back to the place that did not ask to be understood. The town woke slowly that day. But something had changed. It began with whispers. Did you see? There was food. At my door, too. No one knew where it had come from. Some said it must have been a traveler passing through. Others spoke of luck, of chance, of anything that did not require explanation. But hunger does not question kindness for long. It accepts and remembers. The next morning, it happened again. And the next. Not enough to fill every shelf. Not enough to silence every worry. But enough to soften the sharpest edges of fear. Enough to remind the valley that it had not been entirely forgotten. Jonah Hale said nothing. But he noticed. He saw the pattern others missed. The quiet consistency. The care in how each basket was prepared, not thrown together, but given. He followed once, not with suspicion, but with understanding. Keeping his distance, moving gently through the early light, he watched as Eliza placed a basket at a doorstep and turned away before the door could open. There was no pride in her posture, no expectation, just offering. He did not step forward, did not call out. Instead, he returned the way he had come, carrying what he had seen not as a secret, but as something to be protected. That evening, Eliza found her fence mended where it had begun to weaken. The work was careful, precise, done by someone who respected not just the task, but the space it belonged to. She did not question it. Some kindness speaks loudest when left unnamed. Days passed. The valley began to shift in small, almost invisible ways. A door left open a moment longer. A shared meal between neighbors who had once kept their distance. A quiet nod where there had once been silence. And then, the truth began to surface. Not all at once, not with accusation, but through something simpler. Ash. He had begun wandering into town more often, moving through the streets with quiet purpose, stopping at doors that had receive baskets, lingering just long enough to be noticed. Children followed him first, curious, unburdened by pride. "Where are you going?" Their voices soft, footsteps light against the frozen ground. Ash did not rush. He walked the path he knew, the one that led beyond the edge of the valley, the one that curved gently toward the hidden hollow. One by one, a few adults followed, not boldly, not as a group claiming discovery, but carefully, as if stepping into something they were not sure they deserved to see. When they reached the hollow, they stopped. No one spoke. Before them lay the small stretch of land that had refused to give up, green against the pale world, alive in a place that had forgotten how to be. And at its center, Eliza, kneeling, her hands in the soil, her movements as quiet and steady as they had always been. She looked up slowly, saw them. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, just a stillness like water that has learned to hold reflections without breaking. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of their past laughter lingered there, unspoken but understood. Finally, one of them stepped forward. "We didn't know." The words were fragile, uncertain. Eliza brushed her hands together gently, rising to her feet. The wind moved softly through the hollow, carrying the faint scent of earth that still lived. The land gives when it is listened to. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, not as a lesson, not as a correction, just truth. No one argued. No one defended themselves, because there was nothing left to defend. Something shifted in that moment. Not forgiveness, not entirely, but something close enough to begin. In the days that followed, the hollow was no longer just hers. People came carefully. They did not take without asking. They did not speak loudly. They watched, learned, helped where they could. The farm grew, not quickly, not wildly, but steadily, as if it too was learning how to trust. And in the quiet spaces between work and rest, something else began to grow. Not in the soil, but between two people who had never needed many words. One evening, as the sky softened into hues of fading gold, Eliza stood near the edge of the hollow. Jonah approached, carrying nothing, expecting nothing. They stood side by side, looking out over the small stretch of life that had changed more than just the land. "You stayed." Her voice was barely above the wind. Jonah's gaze remained steady. Some things are worth staying for. He did not look at her when he said it. He did not need to. The meaning settled gently between them, like the first warmth after a long cold. No promises were made, no confessions spoken, but something real, something steady had taken root. Above them, snow still drifted lightly from the sky, but it no longer felt like an ending. Not anymore. The storm did not ask for permission. It came in the night, heavy and unrelenting, folding the valley into itself with wind that howled like something long forgotten had returned to be heard. Snow did not fall gently this time. It struck the earth in thick, blinding waves, swallowing paths, bending trees, pressing against doors as if it meant to enter. The valley held its breath again, but this time it trembled. Inside her cabin, Eliza May Carter stood by the window, the glass rattling softly beneath the force of the wind. The fire behind her flickered low, its warmth struggling against a cold that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ash was already awake. He stood near the door, still and alert, his ears tuned to something deeper than the storm itself. There was a tension in him, quiet but unmistakable. Eliza felt it too. Not fear, not exactly, but a knowing. The kind that settles in the chest before something important is about to be tested. She reached for her coat, without hesitation, wrapped her scarf tighter, her hands moving with a steadiness that did not come from certainty, but from purpose. Ash did not wait. The moment the door opened, he stepped into the storm, his shape almost swallowed by the white before she could follow. The cold struck hard, sharp against her skin, stealing breath for just a moment before she found it again. The world beyond her cabin had disappeared into a blur of wind and snow. The path she knew so well was gone, but Ash moved as if it had never left. She followed, step by step, trusting what she could not see. The storm pushed against her, heavy, insistent. But there was something stronger beneath her movements, something rooted deeper than the cold could reach. By the time they reached the hollow, the wind had begun to shift, not weaker, but wilder. The hidden farm lay beneath a thickening layer of snow. Fragile coverings strained under the weight. The small, steady life that had held on for so long now stood at the edge of being lost. Eliza moved quickly, her hands brushing away snow, reinforcing what she could, her breath coming harder now in the biting air. Not this. The words slipped from her, carried away before they could settle. Ash circled the edges, then darted toward a section where the wind had begun to tear through the protective layers. He barked once sharp, urgent, and then another figure emerged through the storm. Jonah. He moved with the same quiet determination he always carried, though the storm fought him at every step. Without a word, he joined her, his hands already working, securing, lifting, holding against the force that threatened to undo everything. There was no time for conversation, only action, guided by something deeper than thought. Together they worked, not frantically but steadily, each movement chosen, each effort shared. The storm raged on, but within that small hollow, something else stood its ground. Time lost its shape. Minutes stretched into something longer. The wind howled, the snow pressed, and still they remained. Until, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the storm began to pass. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for the wind to soften. Enough for the snow to fall lighter, like a final breath instead of battle. Eliza straightened slowly, her body aching, her hands numb despite her efforts. She looked over the farm, her chest tight as she searched for what remained. The coverings held, the soil beneath still protected, the green still there. A breath she had not allowed herself to take finally escaped her. It survived. Her voice was barely a whisper. Jonah nodded once, his gaze moving across the hollow. It did, but something else had changed. Ash. He had moved away from them, toward the edge of the hollow where the wind had struck hardest. His body lay still against the snow, his gray coat blending almost seamlessly into the white. Eliza's heart stilled. She crossed the distance quickly, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands found him, brushing snow from his fur, searching for movement. Ash. His name broke softly from her, not loud, never loud, but filled with something deeper than sound. His eyes opened just slightly, still steady, still knowing. He had done what he had always done. Stayed, guided, protected. Her hands trembled now, not from the cold. You can rest. The words came gently, the way she had always spoken to the soil, to the fragile life that trusted her. Ash's breathing slowed, then stilled. There was no struggle, no fear, just a quiet letting go. Eliza bowed her head, her forehead resting lightly against his. The storm had passed, but something inside her had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Jonah stood a few steps back, his presence steady, not intruding on the moment, but not leaving it either. Some grief is meant to be held, not fixed. Time moved again. The sky began to clear, pale light breaking softly through the thinning clouds. The valley, once buried beneath the storm's weight, began to emerge, quiet, changed. By morning, the snow had settled into stillness, and beneath it, something else stirred. The first signs of melting. Not much, not enough to call it spring, but enough to know that winter had begun to loosen its hold. Word spread quickly through the valley. The storm had passed, and somehow, the hidden farm still stood. People came again, not with curiosity this time, but with something closer to respect. They worked together, clearing what they could, reinforcing what remained, their movements guided by the same quiet care Eliza had always shown. No one laughed anymore. Some things, once seen clearly, cannot be misunderstood again. Caleb Boone approached slowly one afternoon, his steps uncertain in a way they had never been before. He stopped a few feet from Eliza, his hands empty, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "I was wrong." No explanation followed. No excuses. Just truth. Eliza looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer needed to be carried forward. The valley changed after that. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but honestly. People listened more, shared more, remembered. The hidden farm remained, though it no longer needed to be hidden in the same way. It had become something else, not just a place of survival, but a place of understanding. Near its edge, beneath a small rise where the wind softened, Eliza placed a simple marker. No grand words, no elaborate carving, just a quiet space where Ash rested. The dog who had seen what others could not. The dog who had led her, and then all of them, to something worth saving. Seasons shifted slowly after that. The snow melted fully, giving way to soil that began, carefully, to breathe again. Green returned, not in abundance at first, but in promise. The valley remembered, and so did its people. One evening, as the light of a gentler sun stretched across the land, Eliza stood at the edge of the hollow. Jonah beside her, close but never imposing. The air carried warmth now, faint but real. She looked out over the land that had once been silent, now slowly finding its voice again. "You stayed." She said it again, softer this time. Jonah's gaze did not waver. "So did you." The words settled between them, simple and true. No more was needed, because some things once rooted do not need to be spoken to be understood. And maybe, somewhere beyond this story, beyond this valley, there's a quiet strength in you too. The kind the world might overlook. The kind that keeps growing, even when no one sees it. Because not everything that saves us arrives loudly. Sometimes, it is a widow, a patch of hidden earth, and a faithful heart that refuses to let the cold win. If this story stayed with you, even in a small, quiet way, take a moment to like and share your thoughts below. Tell me what part touched you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that feel like they were meant just for you. And before you go, where are you watching from tonight?